Your mind is not inside your head. That sentence sounds wrong at first. It almost feels like it shouldn't make sense at all. When you hear it, there's an immediate resistance, as if something inside you is rejecting it before you even think about it properly. That reaction is normal, because everything you've ever been taught, everything your experience suggests, tells you the opposite. That your thoughts, your awareness, your entire inner world must be happening somewhere inside your skull. But what if that assumption itself is the real mistake? Not a poetic mistake, not a spiritual interpretation, not a mystical idea about souls or energy floating outside the body. None of that. What we are talking about here is something far more uncomfortable. The possibility that modern science, when followed carefully and without shortcuts, does not actually support the idea that your mind is strictly contained inside your brain in the way we casually assume. The strange part is that the more you look into neuroscience, physics, and the philosophy of mind, the more this simple picture starts to break apart. The idea that consciousness is inside your head is not a proven fact. It is a habit of thinking we inherited from intuition, reinforced by daily experience, but not something that has ever been fully justified by science itself. Let's start with what seems absolutely solid. You have a brain. It sits inside your skull. It weighs about 1.5 kilograms, consumes roughly 20 watts of energy, and contains around 86 billion neurons connected through an unimaginably complex network of over 100 trillion synaptic connections. This is not speculation. It is measurable biology. And there is a clear relationship between this system and your experience. When you see something red, specific neurons in your visual cortex activate. When you feel pain, regions like the somatosensory cortex and anterior cingulate cortex respond. Fear involves the amygdala. Memory involves the hippocampus. Damage certain areas, and specific aspects of experience disappear. Change brain chemistry, and consciousness changes. Stop brain activity entirely, as in deep anesthesia, and experience vanishes. The correlation is so consistent, so precise, that it feels undeniable. Naturally, the conclusion seems obvious. The brain produces the mind. Consciousness is what the brain does. Your inner world is generated by neural activity inside your skull. This view is called physicalism. It is the dominant scientific assumption. It says that everything about your experience, color, pain, emotion, thought, is ultimately the result of physical processes in the brain. There is nothing extra needed, just matter, energy, and information processing at a very high level of complexity. For most people, including many scientists, this feels like the end of the story. But there is a problem, a deep one, a persistent one. A problem so difficult that philosopher David Chalmers called it the hard problem of consciousness. And this problem changes everything. Because even if you fully explain how the brain processes information, how signals travel, how neurons fire, how perception is constructed, you still haven't explained something crucial. You still haven't explained why any of it feels like anything from the inside. You can describe every physical event involved in seeing red, photons hitting the retina, electrical signals traveling through the optic nerve, activity spreading across the visual cortex, but none of that explains why there is an experience of redness at all. Why isn't it all just silent information processing with no inner life? That gap between physical description and subjective experience is the hard problem, and it does not go away with more detail. It remains even in the most complete scientific explanation imaginable, which raises a disturbing possibility. Maybe the framework we are using is incomplete. Maybe describing neurons and signals is not enough because consciousness is not the kind of thing that fits neatly inside that framework. To see why this idea has gained serious attention, philosophers often use a thought experiment known as Mary's room. Mary is a brilliant neuroscientist who has spent her entire life in a black and white room. She knows everything there is to know about the physics and biology of color vision. She understands wavelengths, retinal cones, neural pathways, everything. But she has never actually seen color herself. Then one day, she steps outside and sees a red apple for the first time. The question is simple. Does she learn something new? Most people intuitively say yes. She learns what red actually looks like. But if she already knew all physical facts about color vision, then this suggests something surprising. Physical knowledge alone did not capture the full reality of experience. Something was missing. And that missing something is exactly what makes the mind so mysterious and what pushes some thinkers to wonder whether consciousness is really just inside the brain at all. Because once you accept that there may be a gap between physical description and experience, the next question becomes unavoidable. What kind of reality does experience actually belong to? And that is where things begin to get even more unusual. And that is where things begin to shift in a way that most people never expect. Because once you seriously question whether experience can be fully captured by physical description alone, you are no longer just talking about philosophy anymore. You are stepping directly into the deepest unresolved questions in modern physics itself. At the center of this shift is something called quantum mechanics. It is not a fringe theory. It is the most successful scientific framework ever created. It describes the behavior of atoms, electrons, photons, and every fundamental particle we know with extreme precision. Its predictions have been confirmed to an almost unimaginable degree of accuracy. But despite its success, quantum mechanics hides a problem that physicists still do not fully agree on. It is called the measurement problem. At the quantum level, reality does not behave the way our everyday intuition suggests. Particles do not have definite properties in the way we expect. An electron, for example, does not exist in a single fixed position before it is measured. Instead, it exists in a kind of spread-out probability state, often described as a superposition of many possible positions at once. Mathematically, this is represented by something called a wave function. The wave function evolves smoothly and predictably over time when left alone. But the moment we try to observe or measure the system, something strange happens. The wave function seems to collapse, and suddenly we get a single definite outcome. One position, one result, one reality. The question is simple but deeply unsettling. What exactly causes this collapse? In standard textbook physics, the answer is often left vague. We are told that measurement causes it, but what counts as a measurement is never clearly defined. Is it a machine, a particle interaction, a human observer? The theory does not say precisely. This ambiguity leads to one of the most controversial ideas in the history of physics, the possibility that observation itself plays a fundamental role in determining physical reality. And if you follow that idea carefully, without jumping to mystical interpretations, you eventually arrive at a very specific question. What exactly is an observer? This is where physicist John von Neumann enters the story. In the 1930s, he analyzed quantum mechanics with extreme mathematical precision and traced the measurement process step by step. He showed that you can treat the measuring device itself as a quantum system. But then the device also enters a superposition. If you include the brain of the observer, that too becomes part of the quantum system. At no point in this chain does the collapse naturally explain itself. So von Neumann proposed a radical conclusion. Somewhere along the chain of observation, something outside the physical description must be involved. And the only candidate he could identify was consciousness itself. In this view, consciousness is not just another physical process inside the system. It is the point at which physical possibilities become a single experienced reality. Now, many physicists today do not accept this interpretation. There are alternative frameworks, such as many worlds or decoherence theory, that attempt to explain the measurement problem without invoking consciousness at all. These approaches are serious and mathematically consistent. But here is the key point. None of them actually explain why there is experience in the first place. They describe how outcomes appear, but not why there is something it feels like to observe those outcomes. So even if consciousness is removed from quantum mechanics, the deeper mystery remains untouched. This is where a different kind of theory enters the picture, one that does not come from physics alone, but from neuroscience and information theory. It is called Integrated Information Theory, or IIT, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi. IIT starts from a very different observation. It does not begin with particles or fields, but with experience itself. It asks a simple question: what must a system be like in order for it to have experience? According to IIT, consciousness is not something added to complex systems. Instead, it is identical to a specific kind of informational structure, integrated information. In simple terms, a system is conscious to the degree that it unifies information in a way that cannot be broken into independent parts. This leads to a surprising implication. Consciousness is not just about brains. It is about structure. Any system that processes information in an integrated way has at least some minimal form of experience associated with it. At this point, something important begins to emerge. The boundary between mind and matter starts to blur. Because if experience corresponds to integrated information, then consciousness is not a rare property that suddenly appears in humans. It becomes something far more fundamental, something potentially present wherever physical systems integrate information. And that idea quietly opens the door to a very different picture of reality. A picture where consciousness is not an exception, but a feature of the universe itself. Integrated information theory takes a step that feels almost upside down compared to traditional neuroscience. Instead of asking how the brain produces consciousness, it asks what consciousness must be like in order to exist at all. And the answer it arrives at is surprisingly mathematical. Consciousness corresponds to a system's capacity to integrate information into a unified whole. In this framework, a system is not conscious simply because it is complex. Complexity alone is not enough. What matters is whether the system's parts are deeply interconnected in such a way that the whole cannot be reduced to independent components without losing something essential. This is where the theory introduces a quantity often represented as phi, a measure of integrated information. The higher the phi, the more unified the system, and according to the theory, the richer the conscious experience. A brain in deep sleep without dreams, for example, shows reduced integration in certain respects, even if neural activity continues. The system remains active, but the unity of experience disappears. On the other hand, during wakefulness, the brain shows highly structured, tightly integrated activity, matching the presence of a unified conscious experience. From this perspective, consciousness is not a mysterious thing added to matter. It is what it feels like when information becomes integrated in a certain way. But if that is true, then an uncomfortable implication follows naturally. If integration of information is what produces experience, then any system that integrates information, even partially, may possess some minimal form of experience. Not human-like experience, not thoughts or emotions, but something far more basic, a primitive form of inner structure, something like the simplest possible version of what it is like to be something. This is where the idea of panpsychism begins to enter the discussion. Panpsychism is the view that consciousness, or at least its most basic form, is not produced by complex systems, but is instead a fundamental feature of reality. In this view, even elementary particles may have the simplest imaginable form of experiential property, not awareness in any meaningful sense, but a kind of proto-experiential aspect embedded in physical existence itself. As strange as this sounds, it is not a modern invention. Versions of this idea appear throughout philosophical history. Thinkers like Leibniz, Whitehead, and William James all considered variations of it. In modern times, it has reappeared in academic philosophy and neuroscience discussions, especially in response to the hard problem of consciousness, because the logic is difficult to avoid. If physical processes do not fully explain experience, and if experience undeniably exists, then either something is missing from physics, or consciousness must be more deeply embedded in physical reality than we previously assumed. Integrated information theory does not explicitly claim panpsychism, but it leans toward a similar implication. Consciousness exists wherever there is sufficiently integrated information, even in very simple systems, though in extremely minimal forms. This leads to a radical shift in perspective. The brain is no longer seen as a machine producing consciousness from non-conscious parts. Instead, the brain becomes a highly specialized structure that organizes and amplifies something that is already, in some form, present at a more fundamental level. And if that is the case, then the question, where is your mind, begins to lose its obvious meaning. Because your mind would not be something neatly located inside your skull. It would be a localized expression of a deeper property of reality itself, something the universe is doing, rather than something contained inside you. And that realization leads directly into an even more unsettling possibility. And that realization leads into a far more unsettling possibility than most people expect at first. Because if consciousness is not something produced inside the brain, but instead something more fundamental, something tied to the structure of information itself, then the brain is no longer the source of experience in the way we normally assume. It becomes more like a filter, or a localized expression of something much deeper that is already present in reality. At this point, it is important to slow down and separate what is being claimed from what is often misunderstood. This is not saying that thoughts float freely in space or that the mind is disconnected from the body. The brain is still clearly essential. Damage it, and experience changes. Stop it completely, and experience disappears from a biological standpoint. But the deeper question is not about correlation. The deeper question is about origin. Does the brain generate consciousness, or does it organize something more fundamental? This is where the idea of panpsychism becomes more serious in academic discussion. Panpsychism does not say that rocks think or that electrons have human-like awareness. That is a common misunderstanding. Instead, it suggests something much more subtle, that the basic building blocks of reality may have extremely minimal, primitive forms of experiential property. Not thoughts, not emotions, not self-awareness, just the simplest possible inside aspect of physical existence. Then, as systems become more complex, these primitive properties do not appear out of nowhere. Instead, they combine, integrate, and structure themselves into higher-level forms of experience. This idea becomes more compelling when you consider how integrated systems behave. In neuroscience, when different parts of the brain lose integration, such as under anesthesia or in certain brain injuries, conscious experience becomes fragmented or disappears entirely. What seems to matter is not just activity, but unified structure. This is exactly what integrated information theory tries to capture mathematically. It suggests that consciousness corresponds to how much a system cannot be reduced into independent parts without losing its essential informational structure. But once you accept that idea seriously, the boundary between mind and matter begins to dissolve. Because if consciousness corresponds to integrated information, then it is not tied exclusively to brains. It becomes a property of any system that processes information in a sufficiently unified way. And this is where the shift becomes profound. Instead of asking how brains create minds, we begin to ask something very different. What kinds of physical systems naturally give rise to unified experience? At this point, even physics starts to feel relevant in a new way, because modern physics does not describe the world as solid objects moving through empty space in a simple mechanical way. At the deepest level, reality is described in terms of fields, probabilities, and information. And information is not just a human concept anymore. In fundamental physics, information has become a physical quantity. It can be stored, transferred, lost, and transformed. Black hole physics, for example, forces us to confront the idea that information is deeply tied to the structure of space-time itself. So if consciousness is connected to information structure, then it is no longer obvious that it must be confined to biological brains. The brain may simply be one of the most sophisticated information integrating systems we know of, but not necessarily the only one that participates in the underlying fabric of experience. This is where things begin to connect back to quantum mechanics in an unexpected way. In quantum theory, systems do not have definite properties until they are measured. Instead, they exist in superpositions of possibilities. The transition from possibility to definite outcome is still one of the most debated issues in physics. Some interpretations try to avoid mystery by removing the need for collapse entirely, while others propose that collapse is real but caused by physical processes we do not yet fully understand. But a few interpretations go further and suggest something more radical, that observation itself is not a passive event, but an active part of how reality becomes definite. This does not necessarily mean human awareness is collapsing wave functions in a mystical sense. That is not a scientific claim, but it does raise a structural question. Why does measurement play such a special role in turning quantum possibilities into classical reality? If reality at its deepest level is informational, and if observation is tied to the organization of information into definite outcomes, then the boundary between physical process and experience-like structure becomes less clear. This is where some physicists and philosophers begin to explore uncomfortable possibilities, not because they want to, but because the formal structure of the theories leaves room for them. And one of those possibilities is that consciousness is not something added to physics later. It is something already implied by the way information behaves at the most fundamental level. This brings us back to the central question that started everything. Where is your mind? If the brain is just a highly organized information processing structure, and if consciousness corresponds to the integration of that structure, then your mind may not be a thing located neatly inside your skull. Instead, it may be an emergent point of view generated wherever the universe organizes information in a sufficiently unified way. In other words, the mind is not a container sitting inside the body. The body may be part of a larger informational process that gives rise to what it feels like to be you. And once that idea enters the picture, it forces us to reconsider something very basic about how we think reality is structured. Because if experience is fundamental or even partially fundamental, then the universe is no longer just something that exists out there in silence. It is something that is, in some sense, being experienced. And once that idea enters the picture, it forces a completely different way of looking at reality itself, because now the universe is no longer just a collection of objects moving through space. It becomes something that is structured around relationships, information, and potentially even experience at a fundamental level. If consciousness is not something produced after the fact, but something tied to the way information is organized, then the line we draw between physical world and inner experience starts to blur. What we normally call matter might not be the opposite of mind, but just one way of describing a deeper underlying structure that contains both. This is where theories like integrated information theory become more than just neuroscience models. They start to look like attempts to formally describe what being a system actually means from the inside. Instead of treating consciousness as a side effect of brain activity, they treat it as something identical to certain patterns of integration. And if that is true, then consciousness is not rare. It is not something that suddenly appears when matter becomes complicated enough. It is something that exists in degrees, depending on how unified and interconnected a system is. That immediately changes the way we think about the brain. The brain is still crucial, but not necessarily because it creates consciousness out of nothing. It may be crucial because it organizes and amplifies it into the rich, stable experience we recognize as a mind. But then, a deeper question appears. If experience is tied to information integration, what about systems that are not biological? What about physical processes everywhere in the universe that also process information in some form? At the level of physics, information is not an abstract idea anymore. It is embedded in the structure of reality itself. Quantum systems evolve through informational states. Particles exist in probability distributions. Even space-time in some modern theories is deeply connected to informational relationships. So the question quietly shifts again. It is no longer just about brains. It becomes about whether the universe, at its most basic level, has an informational structure that inherently carries a minimal form of what it is like to be that structure. This is the point where panpsychism becomes relevant again, not as a mystical claim, but as a logical extension of the problem. If you reject the idea that consciousness magically appears from non-conscious matter, and if you also reject the idea that experience is an illusion, then you are left with a very limited set of possibilities. Either consciousness is fundamental, or our entire framework for describing reality is incomplete. And that brings us back to quantum mechanics, where observation plays a role that still feels deeply mysterious. Even though modern interpretations try to remove the observer from the equation, the fact remains that measurement marks a fundamental transition between possibility and definite reality. Why that happens is still unknown. Some researchers cautiously suggest that information and observation may be more deeply connected than we currently understand. Not in a mystical sense, but in the sense that reality may only become definite when informational relationships are resolved into stable structures. And if consciousness is tied to information structure, then the act of observation is no longer something external to physics. It becomes part of the same informational process that physics is describing. At this point, something very subtle emerges. The question is no longer, does consciousness exist inside the brain? The question becomes, what kind of role does consciousness play in the way reality organizes itself? And that shift leads directly into the final and most uncomfortable implication of all, that the mind you experience as you may not be a thing sitting inside your head at all. It may be a localized perspective within a much larger informational process, where the boundary between observer and observed is not as clean as everyday thinking suggests. And if that is even partially true, then the phrase, your mind is inside your brain, starts to look less like a scientific conclusion and more like a useful simplification we have mistaken for reality. Because what we actually observe is not a mind sitting inside a skull, but a consistent relationship between brain activity and experience. Every change in neural structure corresponds to a change in consciousness. Every alteration in chemistry changes what is felt. The brain is undeniably central, but central does not necessarily mean origin in the way we assume. It may instead mean interface, a structure where deeper physical processes and experiential structure meet in a way that produces the stable illusion of an inner world located inside a body. From this perspective, the brain is not a container holding consciousness. It is a highly specialized system that organizes experience into a coherent, continuous point of view. What you call your mind is what it feels like for a particular region of the universe to be integrated in a very specific way. This does not remove science from the picture. It deepens it. It suggests that the hardest problem in neuroscience is not just understanding how neurons fire, but understanding why any physical process is accompanied by a subjective point of view at all. And that is where the hard problem returns in its most direct form. No matter how detailed our description of brain activity becomes, there remains a question that does not go away. Why is there something it feels like to be that activity? You can describe every physical mechanism involved in perception, memory, emotion, and thought, but the feeling itself is never found in the description. It always appears as something additional, something that seems to sit alongside the physical story rather than inside it. And that is the gap that continues to challenge everything we think we know. Some researchers believe this gap will eventually close with better neuroscience. Others believe it points to a deeper revision of physics itself. And some argue that it reveals that consciousness is not an emergent property at all, but a fundamental aspect of reality that physics has not yet fully incorporated. None of these positions are final. None are universally accepted. But what is clear is that the question cannot be dismissed as philosophical speculation anymore. It sits directly at the intersection of neuroscience, physics, and information theory. And it forces a conclusion that is as simple as it is unsettling. We do not actually know where the mind is. We know where brain activity happens. We know how information is processed. We know how behavior is generated. But the location of subjective experience itself, what it is, where it exists, and what it is made of, remains an open question at the deepest level of science. So when we say your mind is inside your head, we are not stating a proven fact. We are expressing a model that works well for everyday life, but may not fully capture the underlying structure of reality. And if future theories of physics and consciousness continue in the direction we are beginning to see, That simple assumption may eventually be replaced by something far more radical, the idea that mind is not inside the universe, but that the universe, in some fundamental sense, is already inside mind-like structure at every level.